You don't own this road anymore. That was the message written across the gate in everything but words. A brand new iron barrier, black powder-coated steel, professionally installed. With a keypad and a single security camera mounted above, stretched across the only road leading to my family's property. Bolted to its frame was a sign in bold red letters, "Private HOA road members only, violators will be towed." I had been away for 2 weeks on a construction consulting project in Nevada, and in that short window of time, someone had decided to lock me out of the land my family had owned for nearly 4 decades. I sat in my truck, engine idling, staring at this thing that hadn't existed 14 days ago, feeling like a stranger at my own front door. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I rolled down my window and punched in the old community code 4 digits that had worked at the shared intersection gate for as long as I could remember. The keypad responded with a single flat beep, and the display flashed, "Access denied." I tried again, more deliberately this time. Same result. The barrier remained motionless, indifferent to my presence, to my history, to the fact that my grandfather had driven this road before the people behind this gate had ever heard of Maricopa County. I was an engineer who built infrastructure for a living, and I understood immediately that this wasn't some makeshift obstruction thrown together overnight. Someone had planned this, funded it, and executed it with precision. The installation alone would have cost several $1,000s, not counting permits and labor. That's when I noticed the document tucked beneath my windshield wiper. I stepped out into the September heat and pulled the paper free. It was printed on letterhead I'd never seen: Sunset Ridge Community Association. The name meant nothing to me. My family's property had been here long before any homeowners association existed in this part of the county, yet here was this letter, addressed to Property Owner Right Parcel, treating me like a trespasser on my own land. The contents made my chest tighten with each line. According to Article 7.3 of the bylaws enacted in 2019, all property owners utilizing community-maintained access roads were required to hold an active HOA membership. The demands were clear: sign the membership agreement within 30 days, pay $4,200 in retroactive fees, and comply immediately with all community standards. Failure to do so would result in legal action for trespassing. The signature belonged to Gerald Hoffman, president of Sunset Ridge Community Association. Gerald Hoffman. The name caught somewhere in my memory like a fishhook. I'd heard it before, years ago, in a context I couldn't immediately place. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my laptop bag. Whatever this was, it required more than roadside speculation. I needed information, documents, and a clear head. I pulled out my phone and called my mother. She answered quickly, her voice tight with 5 days of accumulated worry. They had installed the gate while I was gone. She'd tried reaching me, but I'd been buried in meetings, and she hadn't wanted to add to my stress. For nearly a week, my 70-year-old mother had been effectively trapped, forced to navigate an old dirt path that her sedan could barely handle. The isolation had worn on her. I could hear it in the pauses between her words, the way she measured each sentence as if afraid to sound too alarmed. She'd gone to the HOA office in person, a clubhouse in the new development across Miller Road, hoping to resolve things face to face. A woman at the front desk had listened with practiced indifference, then informed her that all requests must be submitted in writing. Formal channels only. No exceptions. No one in authority was available, and no timeline was given for any response. I asked her what I was supposed to do in the meantime. My mother continued. She just said it wasn't her department. "They're saying we have to join, Curtis," she added quietly, "that we don't have any choice." I looked at the gate one last time. My grandfather bought this land when there was nothing here but creosote and sky. My father grew up on this property, built our house with his own hands, and maintained this road himself for years before the county assumed responsibility for the easement. Now, an organization I'd never heard of was demanding money we didn't owe for access we'd never needed permission to have. I told my mother not to worry, that I would handle it, and hung up. Then I did something that would define everything that followed. I started documenting. I approached the gate methodically, the way I'd approach a construction site assessment. I photographed it from multiple angles straight on, from both sides, and close-ups of the sign and the keypad. I captured the mounting brackets where steel met concrete, evidence of professional installation. I photographed the letter front and back, making sure every word was legible. Then I recorded a video, narrating as I went the date, the time, my location, the access code I was entering, and the denial message that followed. The metadata would embed automatically timestamp, GPS coordinates, device information, verifiable, admissible. I didn't know yet how far this would go, but I knew enough to build a record from the very first moment. In disputes like this, documentation wasn't just helpful. It was everything. I wasn't going to ram the barrier or shout at the camera. That's exactly the reaction they wanted: something emotional, something aggressive, something they could use to paint me as the problem. I drove home the long way instead, following a rutted dirt path that skirted the eastern edge of the development. The route connected to an old utility easement behind our property, never meant for regular traffic. My truck handled it fine, but I thought of my mother trying to navigate these ruts in her 15-year-old Camry, and my jaw tightened. 25 minutes to travel a distance that should take 3. When I finally pulled up to the house, sunset was bleeding across the horizon in shades of copper and ash, and my mother stood on the porch looking somehow smaller than I remembered. Inside, I spread the letter on the kitchen table and examined it the way I'd examine construction blueprints or contract language, looking for assumptions, inconsistencies, leverage points. The HOA cited bylaws from 2019, but our family deed was recorded in 1987. The easement for this road, the legal right-of-way, had been filed with Maricopa County in 1992, years before Sunset Ridge Community Association even existed. You couldn't retroactively claim authority over rights that predated your own formation by decades. The math didn't work. The law didn't work, which meant either they didn't understand property rights, or they were counting on me not understanding them. I circled the signature at the bottom of the page, Gerald Hoffman. And then the memory surfaced, clear and sharp, roughly 10 years ago. A man had approached my father about buying our property. He'd made 3 offers over several months, each one more insistent than the last. My father had refused every time. His final words on the matter absolute: "This land isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever." I was there for that last conversation. I remembered the man's face, the controlled frustration, the way he'd smiled without warmth as he walked away. His name had been Hoffman. I stared at the letter, at the demands wrapped in legal language and bureaucratic process, and understood with cold clarity that this had nothing to do with HOA bylaws or community standards. This was leverage. This was pressure. This was a man who'd been told no a decade ago and had spent the years since finding another way to get what he wanted. The gate wasn't about access fees or membership compliance. It was about forcing my family to either submit or sell. He thought blocking our road would break us. He thought paperwork and threats and the weight of over 100 households would be enough to make us fold. He was about to learn otherwise. I woke before dawn the next morning, my mind already working through the problem. When something doesn't hold up, you go back to the foundation original specifications, approved plans, documented facts. My mother was still asleep when I slipped into her study and knelt before the old fireproof safe my father had installed decades ago. She'd spent the past 5 days waiting for me to return, unwilling to navigate legal confrontation alone. At 70, with no background in property law and a lifelong aversion to conflict, she'd done what made sense, documented what she could, avoided escalation, and trusted that I'd know how to respond. It wasn't passivity, it was patience. And now that I was home, patience would give way to action. The deed was exactly where it had always been, tucked into a manila folder alongside my parents' marriage certificate and my father's military discharge papers. Dated 1987. Recorded with Maricopa County. Signed and stamped with all the formality that legal ownership requires. But what I needed wasn't the ownership itself. It was paragraph 4, together with a perpetual non-exclusive easement for ingress and egress over the existing access road as described in Exhibit B. The attached survey showed the road clearly marked, running from the county highway to our property line. This wasn't ambiguous. This was a legal right-of-way, attached to the land itself, predating any HOA by more than 2 decades. Whoever had built that gate either didn't know this easement existed or knew and didn't care. I spent the next 3 hours navigating the Maricopa County Recorder's online database, systematically pulling every document related to our property and the surrounding development. The plat map from 1992 confirmed what I already suspected: the access road was recorded as a public right-of-way, not private, not restricted, not subject to any future homeowners association. Sunset Ridge Community Association's original CCNRs, filed in 2008, reinforced this further. Their boundary map, Exhibit A, showed the eastern edge of HOA jurisdiction, stopping a full quarter-mile from the road in question. Our property wasn't just outside their territory. It wasn't even close. But then I found the discrepancy that changed everything. A second version of the CCNRs had been filed in 2019, labeled as an Amendment to Declaration of Covenants. The language in Article 7 had been expanded, adding subsections about community-maintained access infrastructure and authority to regulate usage by adjacent property owners. More critically, Exhibit A had been replaced entirely. The new boundary map extended HOA territory to include the access road, the same road that had been a public right-of-way for nearly 3 decades. I pulled both maps onto my screen side by side. The original clear separation, the amendment absorption. Someone had redrawn the lines and filed the changes as if they were legitimate. The alteration was subtle enough to escape casual notice. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. A boundary that had protected our access for years had simply been erased with a few strokes of digital revision. I sat back and considered what I was looking at. This wasn't bureaucratic confusion or good faith misinterpretation. This was deliberate revision. Someone had taken the original CCNRs, modified them to claim authority they'd never possessed, and submitted the altered documents to the county. The question wasn't whether the changes were valid. The question was whether proper procedures had been followed: homeowner votes, public notice, and legal review. If any of those steps had been skipped or fabricated, the entire amendment could be challenged. But proving that would require access to internal HOA records they had no obligation to hand over voluntarily. I composed an email to the HOA, keeping my tone neutral. I identified myself as the owner of the right property, referenced their letter, and made 3 specific requests: meeting minutes from the session approving the gate installation, the legal basis for requiring non-members to join the association, and the current boundary map on file with the county. I noted that Arizona revised statutes required HOAs to respond to document requests within 10 business days. Professional. Measured. Nothing they could characterize as hostile. I hit send and logged the timestamp in a new correspondence file I'd created alongside my growing collection of evidence deed. Plat map. Both versions of the CCNRs, my photos and video from the gate, and the letter demanding payment, while waiting for a response that might never come. I called the county assessor's office. The woman who answered was helpful in the distracted way of government employees handling routine inquiries. I gave her my parcel number and asked directly, was my property subject to any HOA liens, assessments, or jurisdictional claims? Her keyboard clicked. A brief pause. Then, no, sir. This parcel shows no HOA association. Independent rural residential. No liens, no assessments, no membership obligations on file. I asked her to repeat it, wrote down her exact words along with her name and the time of the call. Official confirmation from the county itself that contradicted everything the HOA was claiming. If this ever went to court, that phone call would matter. Every piece of evidence mattered. The response from Sunset Ridge arrived just before dinner, not from an official association address. I noticed. But from a personal email belonging to someone named Sandra Mercer. The message was brief, almost dismissive. Your request has been received and is under review. Please refrain from further contact until our office has completed its assessment. Additional inquiries may delay processing. No timeline, no acknowledgement of my specific questions, no indication that anyone intended to actually address the substance of my concerns. Just bureaucratic deflection dressed up as procedure, the kind of non-answer designed to frustrate and discourage. I read the email twice, then added it to my log with a note about the sender's personal address. A legitimate HOA operation would use official channels, maintain professional communication standards, and respond within statutory timeframes. This felt different, improvised, defensive, buying time. They were stalling, hoping I'd either lose patience or make a misstep they could exploit. What they didn't understand was that the delay worked in my favor. Every day they avoided answering my questions was another day I could use to strengthen my position, gather more evidence, and identify more inconsistencies in their claims. I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was my right to that road. My mother came into the kitchen as I was organizing the final documents. She looked at the spread of papers on the table, printouts of maps and legal filings, my handwritten notes, the careful structure of a case being built piece by piece, and something shifted in her expression. Not hope exactly, but recognition. She'd seen this before, in a different context, with a different man. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from me, her eyes moving over the evidence I'd assembled. "Your father kept records too," she said quietly. "Every offer they made, every conversation, every letter. He said paper was the only thing that couldn't change its story." I thought of the man who'd refused to sell this land no matter how many times Gerald Hoffman came asking. He'd understood something fundamental about ownership, that it wasn't just a deed in a safe, but a willingness to defend what was yours against anyone who thought they could take it through pressure or paperwork or sheer persistence. He'd never gotten the chance to see this fight through, but he'd left me the tools to finish it. The HOA expected me to submit. They'd built their gate, sent their letter, and waited for compliance like it was inevitable. They hadn't counted on meeting someone who'd already found the cracks in their foundation. And I was just getting started. 3 days passed without a real response from the HOA. Sandra Mercer's dismissive email sat in my inbox like a closed door, and I was done waiting on the other side. If they wouldn't come to me with answers, I would go to them with questions. I drove to the Sunset Ridge clubhouse on a Wednesday morning, choosing the time deliberately midweek, mid-morning, when office staff would be present but the building wouldn't be crowded with residents. I wanted a conversation, not a spectacle. I also wanted a record. Arizona is a one-party consent state, which means I could legally record any conversation I was part of without informing the other participants. My phone was already running when I walked through the front door. The clubhouse was nicer than I expected: vaulted ceilings, polished tile floors, a reception area that looked more like a boutique hotel lobby than a community office. A woman sat behind the front desk, early 50s, professional in a way that suggested she took her role seriously. The nameplate on her desk read, Sandra Mercer. She looked up as I approached, and something flickered across her face: recognition. Maybe. Or wariness. She knew who I was before I said a word. "I'm Curtis Wright," I said, keeping my voice even. "I own the property on the east side of your development. I'd like to speak with someone about the gate that's blocking my access road." Sandra's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Wright, as I mentioned in my correspondence, all inquiries need to go through formal written channels. We have procedures in place for a reason. I told her I'd already submitted a formal request and was here because my 70-year-old mother hadn't been able to use her own road in over a week before she could respond. A door opened behind her. The man who stepped into the reception area was in his early 60s, silver-haired, wearing a golf shirt and pressed khakis that suggested comfortable retirement. His posture carried the easy confidence of someone accustomed to authority, and when he extended his hand, his smile was warm without being warm at all, the kind of expression that had been practiced until it became reflexive. "I'm Gerald Hoffman," he said, "president of the Sunset Ridge Community Association. I understand you have some concerns about our recent infrastructure improvements." Infrastructure improvements. That's what he called blocking my only access road. I shook his hand briefly and got straight to the point. "The road your gate is blocking has a recorded easement that predates your association. I'd like to understand what legal basis you're claiming for restricting my access." Gerald didn't miss a beat. "Mr. Wright, all roads within our community's jurisdiction fall under HOA management. That's been the case since we were established." I mentioned the discrepancy I'd found the amendment filed in 2019 that seemed to redraw the boundaries. Gerald acknowledged it smoothly, explaining that the membership had voted to expand maintenance responsibilities. All done properly, he assured me, through established procedures. "I'm not a member," I said. "I've never been a member." "How does a vote by your members affect a right-of-way that was recorded with the county before your organization existed?" Gerald's tone shifted. The folksy president routine giving way to something harder. "If you want to use infrastructure that our community maintains, you follow our rules. That's not complicated. We're not asking for anything unreasonable, just participation in the costs and standards that benefit everyone in this area." I pointed out that the county maintained that road, that it was a public easement, and that his association had no legal authority over it. His response was simple: "Our attorneys disagree." The conversation had changed. Gerald took a step closer, lowering his voice as if sharing confidential advice. "Let me be frank with you. Mr. Wright, you have 30 days to sign the membership agreement and settle your outstanding assessments. After that, we'll pursue legal remedies. And I'd encourage you to think carefully about what a prolonged legal dispute does to property values in this area. Your mother's property, for instance. These things have a way of becoming complicated." Something cold settled in my chest. He'd invoked my mother, not as a concerned neighbor mentioning a shared difficulty, but as leverage, a pressure point he could squeeze if I didn't comply. I thought of her standing on the porch when I'd come home, looking smaller than I remembered, waiting for someone to tell her she could access her own land again. And here was this man, in his golf shirt and his polished clubhouse, suggesting that her home could become collateral damage in his campaign to force our submission. I held his gaze and kept my voice steady. "Are you threatening my mother's property value to coerce me into joining your association?" Gerald's practiced warmth returned. "I'm offering perspective. This doesn't have to be adversarial. But if you choose to make it that way, you should understand the consequences." Behind him, I noticed Sandra Mercer staring at her desk, jaw tight, hands frozen on the keyboard. She wasn't comfortable with what she was hearing. That observation filed itself away for later. I thanked him for his time and walked out without looking back. My phone was still recording, in the parking lot. I sat in my truck and replayed the conversation in my mind. Gerald had been polished, confident, and strategically evasive. He'd talked about procedures and votes and community standards. What he hadn't done, not once, not in any form, was explain how his HOA could legally override a recorded easement. He'd deflected, reframed, and finally resorted to implicit threats. That wasn't an oversight. That was the behavior of someone who knew his legal ground was shaky and was hoping intimidation would make the question go away. He'd underestimated how carefully I'd been listening, and how thoroughly I intended to follow up. That evening, a new email arrived, this one from an actual law firm, not Sandra Mercer's personal account. The letterhead belonged to a Phoenix firm I didn't recognize, and the message was formal, precise, and unmistakably threatening. It demanded that I cease unauthorized access to HOA property, warned of legal action for trespassing if I failed to comply, and referenced the board's resolution of March 15, 2019 as the basis for their authority. The language was boilerplate intimidation, the kind of template letter that gets sent to anyone who pushes back, probably drafted before I visited the clubhouse, even concluded. They'd been ready for this. They'd expected resistance and prepared their response in advance, but in their haste to threaten me, they'd given me something valuable, a specific date. March 15th, 2019. The same date on the amendment filing. If I could prove that the meeting on that date was improperly conducted, that the vote was flawed, that notice wasn't given, that the numbers didn't add up, then everything they were standing on would collapse. I added the email to my file, updated my timeline, and circled the date in red. March 15th, 2019. That was the lock. Now I needed to find the key. This wasn't a bureaucratic misunderstanding anymore. It was a coordinated effort to manufacture legal pressure against my family using documents that might not survive scrutiny. Gerald Hoffman had spent years building his authority in this community, and he clearly wasn't used to being challenged. He thought a gate and a threatening letter, and a team of lawyers would be enough to make me fold. He thought invoking my mother's home would shake my resolve. Instead, it had clarified something. This wasn't just about access anymore. It was about whether people like him could rewrite boundaries and fabricate authority, and bully families off land they'd owned for generations. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not to my mother, not to our home. And now, I had a target. What I was uncovering had started to look less like a dispute and more like a coordinated scheme, which meant I needed a lawyer who understood HOA litigation in Arizona. I called the Arizona Department of Real Estate the next morning, explained my situation, and asked for a referral. They gave me 3 names. The first 2 were unavailable for consultations within the month. The third, Daniel Okonkwo, had an opening that Friday. I took it. His office was in a modest building in central Phoenix, nothing flashy, which I took as a good sign. Lawyers who spend money on marble lobbies tend to charge clients to recoup the investment. Daniel himself was a man in his mid-40s, calm and precise in the way of someone who'd spent years separating emotion from evidence. He listened without interrupting as I laid out the facts, the gate, the demands, the 2 versions of the CC&Rs, the confrontation with Gerald Hoffman, and the attorney's letter threatening legal action. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, reviewing the documents I'd brought. Then he looked up. If they're deliberately blocking a recorded easement, that's tortious interference with property rights, he said. But to pursue this effectively, we need evidence that they knew your easement existed and chose to obstruct it anyway. That's what separates a civil dispute from something potentially more serious. Daniel outlined the next steps with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. He would send a formal demand letter requesting specific documents, the full minutes from the March 15th meeting Gerald had referenced, the boundary map currently on file with Maricopa County, and the complete membership roster as of that date. If they refused or stalled, it would strengthen our position. If they complied, we'd have what we needed to examine whether their procedures had actually been followed. I signed the engagement letter and left his office feeling something I hadn't felt since I'd first seen that gate momentum. The HOA's response arrived 8 days later, partial compliance wrapped in bureaucratic formality. They provided the meeting minutes from March 15th, 2019. But the membership roster was conspicuously absent. replaced by a note claiming the information was proprietary and not subject to disclosure. The boundary map they included was the amended version, not the original. They were giving us just enough to appear cooperative while withholding anything that might expose inconsistencies. But even the partial disclosure contained something valuable. According to the minutes, 87 members had voted in favor of expanding HOA authority over the access road. I remembered that number from the original letter. It was meant to sound democratic, unassailable. Except it didn't add up. I pulled up the HOA's annual reports, publicly filed with the county as part of their nonprofit registration. According to the 2018 filing, the most recent before the March vote, Sunset Ridge had 74 member households. The 2019 report, filed 6 months after the vote, showed 81. Neither figure came close to 87. The vote they were citing as their legal foundation had recorded more affirmative ballots than eligible members. I called Daniel with the numbers. His response was measured but pointed, "That's not a rounding error. If they fabricated the count to manufacture legitimacy, we've moved past procedural irregularities into potential fraud territory. Keep building the file." I intended to. There was another layer waiting in the boundary map itself. The amended version filed in 2019 bore a small notation in the corner, a stamp suggesting county surveyor approval. Official-looking, authoritative, the kind of detail most people would accept without question. But I knew from my work in construction that Maricopa County didn't certify private HOA boundary maps. They recorded them as public filings. But certification was an entirely different process reserved for subdivision plats and official surveys. That stamp was either forged or deliberately designed to create a false impression of government endorsement. I photographed it, documented the discrepancy, and added it to the growing evidence file. The pattern was becoming unmistakable: fabricated votes, falsified documents, manufactured authority. But I still didn't understand who Gerald Hoffman really was, what he wanted badly enough to risk fraud charges. The answer started to emerge from an unexpected source. Henry Lawson was one of the original Sunset Ridge residents, a retired contractor in his early 70s who'd served as the association's first president. His name appeared in the 2008 CCNRs as a founding signatory, and I found his address in the public membership directory. I drove to his house on a Saturday afternoon. Uncertain whether he'd talk to a stranger about internal HOA politics, he was more than willing. He was relieved. Henry invited me onto his back patio, offered iced tea, and spoke with the quiet frustration of someone who'd watched something he helped build get corrupted from the inside. When we started this association, it was about maintaining common areas, keeping the neighborhood presentable, resolving small disputes, he said. Gerald joined the board in 2012. By 2015, he was president. Things changed after that. According to Henry, Gerald had systematically consolidated control, rewriting bylaws to extend term limits, appointing allies to committees, and making board meetings uncomfortable for anyone who questioned his decisions. I raised concerns about the 2019 amendment. Henry continued. The vote count seemed wrong to me, too. Gerald said I was misremembering, that procedures had been followed properly. When I kept pushing, I found myself removed from the architectural committee I'd chaired for 6 years. After that, I stopped attending meetings. He looked out at the desert beyond his fence with something close to regret. I should have fought harder, but I was tired, and it seemed easier to step back. I asked him directly whether the original association had ever intended to claim authority over the access road. Henry shook his head. That road was never ours. It was a county easement long before we broke ground on the first house. Everyone who was here at the beginning knew that. Gerald knew that. I asked if he'd be willing to put his account in writing, something formal that could be used if this went to court. Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I've stayed silent too long already. If you're going to fight this, I want to help. I thanked him and drove home with another piece of the puzzle in place. Gerald Hoffman hadn't just bent rules, he'd systematically dismantled the checks that might have stopped him, isolating anyone who objected until he had unchallenged control. But something still didn't make sense. Why target my family's property specifically? Why go to such elaborate lengths to claim a road that had belonged to the county for decades? There had to be something more than HOA expansion driving this. That evening, I updated my case file with everything I'd learned: the vote discrepancy, the fabricated surveyor stamp, and Henry's willingness to testify. The evidence was mounting, but so was the pressure. A new email had arrived while I was at Henry's house, a notice from the HOA's management company informing me that my vehicle had been photographed on the access road and would be towed if found there again. Attached was a grainy image of my truck, time-stamped from 3 days earlier. They were monitoring me now, watching, documenting. Somewhere in the Sunset Ridge clubhouse, Gerald Hoffman was building his own file, preparing his own case, treating my presence on a public easement as evidence of trespass. He thought he could outlast me. He thought surveillance and legal threats would wear me down the way they'd worn down Henry Lawson. He didn't understand that every photograph they took, every threatening letter they sent, every fabricated document they filed was another piece of evidence I could use against them. The more they pushed, the stronger my case became. The county recorder's office in downtown Phoenix was the kind of government building that hadn't been updated since the 80s fluorescent lighting. Laminate counters, rows of filing cabinets visible through reinforced glass. I arrived early on a Monday morning with a list of document requests and the patience to wait as long as necessary. The clerk who helped me was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the methodical demeanor of someone who'd spent decades navigating bureaucratic systems. I gave her the relevant parcel numbers and requested certified copies of all associated filings. She disappeared into the back and returned 20 minutes later with a stack of papers that would change everything. The amended CC&Rs filed in March 2019 contained a detail I hadn't seen before. At the bottom of the cover sheet, in the space designated for filing party, was a name: Gerald R. Hoffman. Not Sunset Ridge Community Association. Not on behalf of the board of directors. Just Gerald Hoffman, listed as an individual. I asked the clerk if this was standard practice for HOA amendments. She shook her head slowly, adjusting her glasses to look at the document more closely. Amendments are typically filed by the association itself, with an accompanying board resolution authorizing the submission. This one doesn't have that. It's unusual. She searched the system for any separately filed resolution and found nothing. Gerald Hoffman had submitted a document that redrew his HOA's boundaries to a government agency without any recorded authorization from the organization he claimed to represent. The clerk made a note in her own records, something about flagging the file for administrative review. I thanked her and walked out with certified copies of everything, including the cover sheet with Gerald's name. This wasn't a procedural oversight or a clerical shortcut. This was a man acting unilaterally while claiming the authority of a democratic institution. I called Daniel from the parking lot. His reaction was immediate. That's an unauthorized filing, at a minimum. It's grounds for the county to void the amendment, at maximum, depending on what else we can prove. It could constitute fraud. He advised me to keep digging. There's usually a reason someone takes risks like this, he said. Find the reason, and you'll understand the whole picture. I sat in my truck for a long moment after hanging up, thinking about what Gerald must have believed when he walked into this same building and filed those papers. He'd assumed no one would check. He'd counted on bureaucratic indifference, on the sheer volume of documents flowing through government offices every day, on the probability that a small boundary amendment for a suburban HOA would never attract scrutiny. He'd been right until someone with a personal stake started asking questions. The reason revealed itself through the Maricopa County Permit Database. Hoffman Drake Development LLC had applied 18 months earlier for a commercial project on a parcel adjacent to Sunset Ridge, a small shopping center with retail space and professional offices. The application was still pending, held up by access and infrastructure concerns. I pulled up the site plan, cross-referenced it with the state business registry, and the entire scheme came into focus. The development's primary vehicle access point was the same road Gerald had blocked with a gate, the same road his unauthorized amendment had reclassified as private HOA property. Hoffman Drake Development listed two principals, Gerald R. Hoffman and Thomas Drake, his brother-in-law. If the road remained a public easement, the project would require county approval for access, environmental reviews, and public comments, with no guaranteed outcome. But if Gerald controlled the road through an HOA, he dominated. He could grant his own project access rights with a simple board vote. The gate wasn't about membership dues. It was about clearing obstacles for a real estate deal worth potentially millions. I thought about my father then, about the 3 offers he'd rejected a decade ago. Gerald had wanted this land even before the development project existed. Maybe he'd always seen our property as an obstacle, something that needed to be absorbed or eliminated. When my father refused to sell, Gerald had waited. He'd joined the HOA board, risen to president, consolidated power, and then manufactured a legal framework that would let him take what he couldn't buy. The personal grudge and the business motive weren't separate. They were intertwined, feeding each other across years of patient scheming. Understanding that made the stakes feel different. This wasn't just about an access road anymore. It was about whether someone could spend a decade building a trap and expect their target to walk into it without a fight. I had the motive. Now I needed to understand how to use it. Rachel Torres was an investigative reporter for a Phoenix television station who'd been covering HOA disputes in the region. Her name had appeared in several articles I'd found during earlier research, and when I called and explained what I'd uncovered, her interest was immediate. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop in Scottsdale. She reviewed the evidence quickly, her focus sharpening with each document. "Gerald Hoffman's name has come up before," she said. "I've had complaints from other Sunset Ridge residents. But no one's been willing to go on record. They're afraid of retaliation." What Rachel brought wasn't validation. I already knew my evidence was solid. What she brought was reach. Her station had legal resources, broadcast capability, and an audience. More importantly, she had contacts at the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which had been investigating HOA complaints with increasing seriousness. "File a formal complaint," she advised. "With what you have, it won't disappear into a bureaucratic void, and when you're ready to go public, call me." Daniel filed the complaint that week, attaching the full evidence package. The department acknowledged receipt within 3 days and assigned a case number. This was no longer a private dispute, it was now a matter of official regulatory inquiry. Simultaneously, Daniel sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA board, demanding immediate removal of the gate and cessation of all communications characterizing my use of the access road as trespassing. The letter cited the recorded easement, the unauthorized nature of the boundary amendment, and potential legal consequences of continued obstruction. It gave them 14 days to comply before we would seek injunctive relief. Their response came faster than expected, but not through legal channels. 3 days after Daniel's letter arrived, a notice appeared on the Sunset Ridge Community Bulletin Board and website. It announced that a disgruntled adjacent property owner was attempting to undermine democratically approved community decisions through frivolous legal threats. Residents were urged to stand united against outside interference and attend an emergency board meeting to discuss protecting community interests. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in the neighborhood knew who they meant. Gerald Hoffman had shifted tactics. He was no longer fighting me through private correspondence and attorney letters. He was mobilizing his community, framing my defense of documented property rights as an attack on collective will. He wanted neighbors to see me as an outsider, an aggressor, someone trying to destroy what they'd built together. But Gerald had miscalculated badly by going public. He'd given Rachel Torres a news hook, a community meeting where accusations would be made. where residents would take sides, where the story would become visual and immediate, by calling an emergency session. He'd created a forum where I could present evidence directly to the people he claimed to represent. And by framing this as democracy versus outside interference, he'd set the stage for a very public demonstration of just how undemocratic his procedures had actually been. I called Rachel and told her about the meeting. She confirmed her cameraman would be there. I called Henry Lawson and asked if he was still willing to speak publicly about what he knew. He paused for a moment, then said yes, he'd stayed silent too long already. I called Daniel and reviewed the presentation strategy, what to show, in what order, and how to let the evidence speak without inflammatory language. We agreed that calm and precision would be more effective than accusation. Let the documents do the work. Let Gerald's own words and actions condemn him. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the Sunset Ridge Clubhouse, the same building where Gerald had threatened my mother's property value. The same reception area where Sandra Mercer had tried to dismiss me with bureaucratic excuses. I'd walked out of that building weeks ago with nothing but a recording and a growing suspicion. Now I would walk back in with certified documents, a founding member willing to testify, and a television crew ready to broadcast whatever unfolded. Gerald Hoffman had spent years consolidating power in that room, silencing dissent, rewriting rules to suit his interests. He thought calling this meeting would rally his community against me. He was about to discover he'd built his own stage for exposure. The Sunset Ridge Clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs had been set up in rows across the main room, and nearly every seat was taken by the time I arrived at 6:45. I counted roughly 60 residents, most watching the door with the kind of anticipation that suggested Gerald's notice had done its job. They were here to defend their community against an outsider. Rachel Torres and her cameraman had positioned themselves near the back wall, unobtrusive but visible. A woman I didn't recognize sat in the front row with a notepad the Department of Real Estate observer Daniel had mentioned. Henry Lawson was seated 3 rows back, looking nervous but resolute. I took a seat near the middle, close enough to be heard when the time came, far enough to read the room. Daniel had coached me let Gerald speak first, let him commit to a narrative, then dismantle it. Gerald Hoffman stood at the front behind a portable podium, flanked by 2 board members I didn't recognize. Sandra Mercer sat at a table to his right, laptop open, ready to take minutes. Gerald was wearing a blazer over his usual golf shirt, a small touch of formality that acknowledged the stakes. When he saw me enter, something flickered across his face before settling into practiced calm. He called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. His opening was exactly what I'd expected, a carefully crafted appeal to solidarity. "We're here tonight because our neighborhood is facing an unprecedented challenge," he began. "An adjacent property owner has chosen to attack the democratic decisions of this association through legal threats. Rather than work with us in good faith, he's attempting to undermine improvements we've made to protect our community." He paused, surveying the room. "I want to assure every resident that our board has acted properly, transparently, and always in your best interests. We will not be intimidated." When he finished, I raised my hand. Gerald's eyes found me immediately. With 60 residents watching and a camera recording, refusing to acknowledge me would look worse than whatever I might say. "The gentleman in the middle," he said, tone deliberately dismissive. "You have something to add." I stood and introduced myself clearly. "My name is Curtis Wright. My family has owned the property east of this development since 1987. I'm the person Mr. Hoffman just described, and I'd like to exercise my right under Article 4, Section 6 of your bylaws to address decisions affecting my property." Gerald's jaw tightened. "This isn't the appropriate—" I kept my voice level. "The bylaws guarantee that right. I'm invoking it now." He glanced at Sandra, who gave a reluctant nod. He had no procedural ground to refuse. I walked to the front of the room carrying documents I'd prepared for this moment. I didn't need to re-explain what I'd found. These residents didn't know the details yet. and brevity would be more effective than repetition. 3 weeks ago, a gate appeared blocking my family's only access road, I began. That road has been a recorded public easement since 1992. When I investigated the HOA's claim of authority, I discovered 3 things. I held up the first document. The boundary amendment filed in 2019 was submitted by Gerald Hoffman personally, not by this association, not with any board resolution on file. He redrew your HOA's boundaries without authorization and filed the altered map with the county as if it were legitimate. I held up the second document. The meeting minutes from that year claim 87 members voted to approve the expansion. According to your own annual reports, Sunset Ridge had 74 member households at that time. I let the silence do the work. 13 phantom votes. I looked directly at Gerald. Can you explain where they came from? The room had gone still. Not the supportive murmur Gerald had enjoyed earlier, something colder, more uncertain. Gerald's response came too quickly. His voice pitched higher than before. Those records are internal association matters. You have no standing to... They're public filings, I said. Anyone can request them. I did. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. The doubt had already taken root. Then Henry Lawson stood up in the third row, his hands gripping the chair in front of him. I was the first president of this association, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd waited years to speak. I helped draft the original bylaws. The access road was never intended to be part of our jurisdiction. It was a public easement before we broke ground on the first house. He looked around at neighbors he'd known for over a decade. Gerald knew that. Everyone who was here at the beginning knew that. And when I raised concerns about the 2019 changes, I was removed from my committee position within 2 weeks. He sat down heavily, as if the effort of speaking had cost him something physical. The room's attention swung between Henry and Gerald, but Gerald didn't get the chance to respond. Movement at the side table caught my eye first. Sandra Mercer had been staring at her laptop screen, but she wasn't typing. Her hands were frozen above the keyboard, trembling slightly. Something was happening behind her eyes, a calculation being made in real time. She looked at Gerald, then at the camera in the back of the room, then at the department observer in the front row. I saw the moment she made her decision. The color drained from her face, and she stood up abruptly, nearly knocking her chair backward. I need to say something. Her voice came out thin, almost fragile. Gerald turned sharply. Sandra, this isn't... He asked me to change the minutes. The words tumbled out as if she'd been holding them underwater and they'd finally broken the surface. After the March meeting, Gerald told me to adjust the vote count. He said it was just a formality, that no one would ever check. She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through her makeup. I didn't understand what it would be used for. I didn't know about the development project or any of it. But I'm not going to prison for him. I'm not losing everything because I trusted the wrong person. The room didn't erupt. It fractured. Small clusters of residents turned to each other, voices overlapping in confusion and anger. Some directed questions at Sandra, others at Gerald, others at board members who looked as blindsided as anyone. Gerald tried to speak, but something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't the controlled environment he'd commanded for years. It was a room full of people realizing they'd been lied to by someone they'd elected to represent them. His authority hadn't been challenged before. Now it was collapsing, and he had no script for how to respond. He stood behind the podium, mouth opening and closing, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked exactly like what he was, a man whose carefully constructed power had been built on a foundation of fraud that was crumbling in real time. The department observer rose from her seat and made her way to Daniel, who had been standing near the side exit. I watched them exchange words, saw her hand him a business card, saw his expression sharpen. Rachel Torres was methodically capturing everything: the disarray, Sandra's tearful admission, and Henry accepting handshakes from residents who'd ignored his warnings for years. Gerald eventually stopped trying to regain control. He stepped away from the podium, walked toward the side door, and left without looking back. No dramatic exit. No final defense, just a quiet retreat that said more than any words could have. Several residents approached me as the crowd began to thin. One apologized for not knowing. Another mentioned she'd been pressured to sign documents she didn't understand when buying her home. A third asked how he could access his own property records to check for irregularities. The pattern Rachel had described was surfacing throughout the room. Daniel found me as the last people were leaving. The department representative confirmed they're coordinating with the county attorney, he said quietly. Sandra's admission changes the landscape entirely. This isn't civil litigation anymore, it's a criminal referral in progress. They'll want her testimony, and based on what she said tonight, she's going to give it. I nodded, absorbing the shift. 3 weeks ago, I'd been standing at a locked gate, wondering how to get home. Now, a state agency was building a case that could send Gerald Hoffman to prison. Outside. The parking lot had emptied except for a few cars. The desert sky was clear, stars emerging as the last light faded from the horizon. I thought about my father, about the offers he'd refused, about the man who'd spent a decade finding another way to take what he couldn't buy. Gerald had miscalculated in the most fundamental way possible. He'd assumed that power built on lies would hold as long as no one asked questions. Someone had finally asked, and the answers were going to cost him everything. Maricopa County Superior Court was a functional government building where ordinary disputes were resolved through paperwork and procedure. I arrived early on a Tuesday morning, wearing a suit I hadn't touched in 3 years. Daniel met me in the lobby, his briefcase thick with documents. Today wasn't a full trial. It was a preliminary hearing on our motion for injunctive relief, requesting immediate removal of the gate while the larger case proceeded. If the judge sided with us, Gerald's legal position would become untenable. If not, we'd be facing months of litigation with my mother still unable to use her own road. The HOA had hired outside counsel, a Phoenix litigation firm specializing in property disputes, and their attorney was already seated at the opposing table when we entered. Gerald Hoffman sat behind him in the gallery, expression carefully neutral. Sandra Mercer was notably absent. According to Daniel, she'd retained her own attorney and was cooperating with investigators. Her empty seat sent a message that Gerald had to be reading clearly. Judge Rebecca Thornton called proceedings to order at 9:15. She was a woman in her late 50s with a reputation for following evidence over rhetoric and issuing clear rulings that didn't invite extended appeals. She reviewed the case summary briefly, then invited Daniel to present our motion. He approached the lectern with characteristic precision. Your Honor, the plaintiff seeks confirmation of an easement recorded since 1992. An injunction requiring removal of a barrier obstructing that easement, and a declaration that the 2019 boundary amendment is void due to procedural deficiencies. He paused. The evidence will demonstrate this amendment was filed by an individual without board authorization, supported by vote counts that exceed the actual membership, and undertaken to serve private business interests rather than legitimate governance. The HOA's attorney objected to the characterization. Judge Thornton overruled him with a slight gesture. Lay your foundation, counselor. He'll have his turn. Daniel walked the court through our evidence efficiently, each exhibit building toward the next without redundant explanation. The easement documentation establishes my family's rights. The original CC&Rs showed HOA boundaries that stopped well short of the access road. Then the 2019 amendment, and here he became surgical. He projected the filing cover sheet, highlighting where Gerald Hoffman's name appeared alone in the filing party field. No board resolution authorizing this submission exists in county records or in the defendant's own files, Daniel said. We requested it through discovery. They couldn't produce it, because it was never created. He displayed the meeting minutes alongside the HOA's annual reports, letting the numbers speak without embellishment. 87 recorded votes. 74 member households. Finally, the Hoffman-Drake development connection, the permit application, the site plan, the business registry. This wasn't community governance. Your Honor. This was a manipulation of an organization to clear obstacles for a private real estate venture. The HOA's attorney mounted the defense you mount when substance is against you procedural technicalities. Standing questions, deference to community associations. It was competent lawyering aimed at delaying rather than winning. Judge Thornton listened without visible reaction, occasionally making notes. Then she did something unusual. "I'd like to hear from Mr. Hoffman directly," she said. Preliminary hearings don't typically involve witness testimony, but given that Mr. Hoffman personally filed the disputed amendment and serves as the Defendant Association's president, I'm exercising discretion to request clarification of the record. Gerald's attorney started to object. Judge Thornton cut him off. "He can decline, Counselor. I'll note that choice appropriately." Gerald had no real option. He rose from the gallery and made his way to the witness stand. The questioning started with simple confirmations: his role, the filing date, his signature. Gerald answered in measured tones, each word carefully selected. Then Judge Thornton asked about authorization. "Mr. Hoffman, standard procedure for boundary amendments requires a formal board resolution. No such resolution exists in any record we've reviewed. Can you explain?" Gerald's response was smooth, almost rehearsed. "There was a resolution approved at the March meeting, Your Honor. If the documentation wasn't properly filed, that would have been an administrative oversight by our secretary, who handled all paperwork at that time. He was deflecting to Sandra, a woman who'd already told investigators he'd directed her every action. Judge Thornton made a note but didn't challenge him directly. Instead, she moved to the vote count. 87 votes from 74 households. Mr. Hoffman, how do you account for the discrepancy?" Gerald didn't hesitate. "Some properties may have had multiple voting rights under our bylaws. Additionally, we occasionally permit proxy voting in certain circumstances. I'd need to review the specific records to provide exact details." His tone remained controlled, cooperative, the voice of a reasonable man dealing with unfortunate confusion. But Judge Thornton had done her homework. "I've reviewed your CC&Rs, Mr. Hoffman. They don't provide for proxy voting on boundary amendments. And multiple voting rights apply only to commercial properties, of which Sunset Ridge has none." Gerald paused just a fraction of a second, but I saw it. "Then there may have been procedural errors I wasn't aware of at the time. As I said, administrative matters were delegated to staff." He was building a wall of plausible deniability, brick by careful brick, blame the absent secretary, claim ignorance of details, present himself as a busy executive who couldn't be expected to verify every document. Judge Thornton tried one more angle. "Mr. Hoffman, are you affiliated with an entity called Hoffman Drake Development LLC?" Gerald's eyes flickered toward his attorney before returning to the judge. "I have some involvement in that company. Yes. And that company has a pending permit application for a commercial development whose primary access point is the same road at issue. In this case..." Another pause. "I'm not certain of the specific details of that application." "The site plan was submitted to this court as Exhibit 14, Judge Thornton said. Would you like to review it?" Gerald's attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client's business interests aren't relevant to this preliminary hearing. We're here to discuss easement rights and HOA procedures. Not, 'Sit down, Counselor.'" Judge Thornton's voice carried an edge that silenced the room. "The relevance is for me to determine." She turned back to Gerald. "Mr. Hoffman, I'm not asking you to incriminate yourself. I'm allowing you to explain how a boundary amendment that benefits your private business interests came to be filed under your personal name without documented authorization. If you have an explanation, now is the time." Gerald sat very still for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. "I respectfully decline to answer further questions on advice of counsel, Your Honor." It was the smartest thing he could have said and the most damaging. Judge Thornton nodded slowly. That's your right, Mr. Hoffman. You may step down. Gerald returned to the gallery without looking at anyone. His attorney's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of someone calculating how to minimize damage rather than win. Judge Thornton announced she would rule from the bench. The plaintiff's easement is clearly established in county records predating the defendant association by 16 years, she said. The amendment purporting to bring that easement under HOA jurisdiction was filed without documented authorization and supported by vote counts that cannot be reconciled with membership records. The court finds plaintiff is likely to succeed on the merits and that irreparable harm is occurring through continued obstruction. She looked directly at Gerald. The defendant association is ordered to remove the gate within 72 hours. The 2019 boundary amendment is declared void, pending full adjudication. Additionally, this matter is referred to the county attorney's office for review of potential criminal violations. The gavel came down. Gerald remained seated as his attorney gathered papers and observers whispered among themselves. He stared at the wall behind the bench, perfectly still, as if processing how completely his position had collapsed. He'd walked into this courtroom expecting procedural delays and legal maneuvering. He was walking out facing criminal referral and a ruling that demolished every claim he'd made. I watched him for a moment, this man who'd spent years constructing an architecture of control, now confronting the reality that evidence doesn't negotiate. Daniel shook my hand as we exited. 72 hours, he said. Your mother can use her road by Friday. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the first clear view of how far the reckoning would reach. 3 weeks after the hearing, I drove home along the access road for the first time since this had all begun. The gate was gone, completely removed. The concrete footings jackhammered out, leaving only patches of fresh gravel where the barrier had stood. I slowed as I passed the spot, registering the absence of something that had dominated my life for nearly 2 months. Just open pavement leading home. The HOA had complied with the court order within 48 hours, faster than required, as if eager to distance itself from everything that structure had represented. I didn't linger. There was nothing left to see, and that was exactly the point. The legal consequences had accumulated steadily in the weeks following the preliminary ruling. The county attorney's office moved faster than Daniel had anticipated, assembling a case built on our evidence and Sandra Mercer's cooperative testimony. Gerald Hoffman was formally charged with 3 counts forgery for the fabricated surveyor stamp, filing false documents for the unauthorized amendment, and attempted extortion for using the gate to coerce compliance. His attorneys negotiated for weeks, and in the end, Gerald accepted a plea agreement, 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, a permanent ban on holding any position in a homeowners association. $15,000 in restitution was paid directly to my family. It wasn't prison, but for a man who'd built his identity around authority, the terms stripped away everything he'd spent a decade constructing. Sandra Mercer's cooperation earned her immunity from prosecution, but consequences found her anyway. The Arizona Department of Real Estate revoked her license for 5 years. She lost her position with the property management company and relocated to New Mexico to start over. Somewhere her name wasn't associated with fraud. I felt something complicated when I learned that not sympathy exactly, but recognition that she'd been caught in Gerald's orbit and made choices she couldn't take back. She'd done the right thing eventually. Whether that absolved her was a question I didn't need to answer. The administrative fallout reshaped Sunset Ridge from the inside. An emergency election replaced the entire board, with Henry Lawson returning as interim president at the residents' request. The new board's first action was a resolution acknowledging improper conduct and issuing a public apology to my family. Their second was commissioning an independent review of all CC&R's amendments from the past decade, which identified 3 other violations requiring correction. The community was cleaning house with the thoroughness of people who'd realized how close they'd come to complicity. Hoffman-Drake Development quietly withdrew its permit application 2 weeks after the plea deal. The shopping center project that had driven this entire scheme would never be built. Rachel Torres's story aired on a Thursday evening, a 12-minute segment tracing the arc from my discovery of the gate to Gerald's prosecution. She'd woven together interviews with Henry, footage from the emergency meeting, and excerpts from public records into a narrative illustrating how easily HOA authority could be corrupted when oversight failed. The response was immediate. Her station received dozens of calls from homeowners across the Phoenix metro area describing similar experiences. The segment became a reference point for advocacy groups working on HOA reform legislation. What had started as one family's fight was becoming part of a larger conversation about accountability and the limits of community association power. I received several inquiries in the weeks that followed from a property rights organization, a local attorney citing my case in a similar dispute, and a journalism student writing her thesis on governance failures. I declined most of them. I'd never wanted to become a symbol. I'd wanted to get home. I'd wanted to protect my mother's right to live on land our family had owned for nearly 4 decades. The larger implications had emerged organically, but they'd never been my primary motivation. I offered Daniel's name as a resource for legal questions, and otherwise returned to ordinary life. The evening after the news segment aired, I sat on the back porch with my mother, watching the sun drop toward the western mountains. The desert was quiet in that particular way it gets at dusk, the day's heat releasing, the first stars emerging, the landscape settling into stillness. She'd been different since the court ruling, lighter somehow. She'd started taking walks again, driving into town without navigating impossible dirt paths, visiting neighbors she hadn't seen in weeks. The isolation Gerald had imposed was over, and she was reclaiming her rhythms with quiet determination. "Your father would have handled it the same way," she said. Not for the first time, but with a different quality, now satisfaction rather than wistfulness. I thought about him, about the offers he'd refused a decade ago, about his insistence that ownership meant being willing to defend what was yours. He'd never gotten to see this fight, but he'd prepared me for it without knowing. The folder on my laptop deed, easement, amendments, transcripts. Judgment was his legacy as much as the land itself. A complete record, preserved for anyone who might need it. I looked out at the road stretching toward the horizon, the same road my grandfather had helped survey when this was nothing but scrub and sky. 3 generations connected by this piece of earth, by the stubborn belief that what you own legitimately cannot be taken through manipulation. Gerald had spent years building toward confrontation, and he'd lost because he'd underestimated what evidence and persistence could accomplish against fabricated authority. He'd assumed no one would check. He'd counted on intimidation outlasting inconvenience. He'd been wrong. The sun touched the mountains and began to sink below the ridgeline. My mother went inside to start dinner, and I stayed on the porch listening to the silence, feeling the solidity of the land beneath me. Tomorrow would bring work, projects, deadlines, the ordinary demands of a life that had been interrupted by something extraordinary. But tonight I simply sat with the knowledge that this ground remained ours, protected not by gates or threats, but by the quiet architecture of truth. My father used to say that paper doesn't change its story. The story of this land was written in documents spanning 4 decades, and it would remain written long after Gerald Hoffman became a footnote. That was the thing about records. They outlasted the people who tried to falsify them. They outlasted schemes and manipulation and the small tyrannies of men who confused authority with ownership. They endured. The stars emerged fully now, scattered across the desert sky, somewhere in the distance. A coyote called, and another answered. I finished my coffee, set the mug aside, and let the evening settle around me. The road was open. My mother was safe. And the truth, finally, had proven stronger than the lie.